Hi, 8th grade. Today we're going to be talking about the elements of literature. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today you probably have already heard. There will be some new information as well. This video is actually a series of videos. You're going to have to watch a couple in a row because for whatever reason I can't record long presentations. So in Canvas, you're going to see a couple links. You're going to have to click on all of those links to get through the whole presentation, but it's okay because we'll break it up into small chunks. So elements of literature. For this presentation, you're going to have to take notes on what you're seeing and learning in the PowerPoint. So quickly pause the video, go back to your assigned desk seat if you don't have a notebook and a pencil, something to write with. Come talk to me if you didn't bring those things to class today, and I'll get you set up. What's nice about these videos is if you have a question, you can jot it down quickly. If I'm talking too fast, you can stop and pause the video, finish your note, and then turn the video back on. It's kind of nice note-taking this way instead of me being up in the front of the class talking and you not being able to stop me or being afraid to stop me and ask a question. So go grab your notebook, grab a pencil. You will have a test over all of this content coming up pretty quickly. And I'll also give you a practice test. On the practice test or pre-test, you can use your notes. So it's important that you take good, thorough notes throughout this presentation. So you'll have an assessment coming up probably within the next couple of weeks, but you're going to be assessed on this stuff and be accountable for this information all year. So you want to make sure you understand it pretty well. And I already really went over this. Feel free to stop and play any time you need me to repeat something. All right, in your notebook, jot down what every story needs. Some of these words will be familiar to you. Every story has a plot that includes exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Every story has a point of view. Every story has a theme. Every story has characters, setting, and conflict. I'm going to go through what these mean in 8th grade very carefully. Again, jot down questions if you don't understand something. We're also going to be reviewing reading strategies. These are things that good readers do while they're reading. Good readers make connections, they visualize, they determine the meaning of new words. There's visualize again, that must just be a typo on my end. Comprehend through summarization. Again, a lot of this will probably be familiar to you. It might look different in 8th grade, so just be careful to pay close attention. So what is plot? Plot is the organization of the main events in a work of fiction. So when I'm talking about plot, I'm generally talking about fiction stories. Those are fake stories. Those are not real nonfiction stories. Pretty much plot is the events in which things happen in a story. It's the sequence of events. What happens first, next, last. They usually track some sort of progressive change where the characters are caught up in a conflict, and we'll talk about conflict in a minute, which is eventually resolved. So plot is the story. The story is the plot. It's the events. It's what happened. This is a diagram of plot. Now you probably have seen this before. I also like to call it a heartbeat plot because it looks like a heartbeat monitor. If you've ever been to a hospital, it's the one that goes beep, beep, beep. Our little hiker guy is going to take you through plot. So he starts off at the exposition. There he goes. He'll head up the rising action, building towards the climax. Then he'll come down toward the falling action, and then finally finish at the resolution. The exposition is what occurs in the beginning of the story. This is where the characters are introduced. This is where we learn about the setting, the where, the when. This section also presents other facts that you need to know to understand the story completely. When students are in the exposition, they usually tell me, well, this story is boring. Well, if you're only in the beginning of the story, nothing has really happened yet. You're still getting to know the characters. You're still getting to know where the setting of the story is. So if you're finding that the story is boring, I'll probably ask you what chapter you're in, and if it's in the first 1, 2, or 3, you're probably just still in the exposition. So just give it some time before the action starts. These are some important things to know about the exposition. Now, the exposition, remember, is our big fancy word for the beginning of the story. You will learn the setting, the time and the place. That happens really quickly in the beginning. You'll also learn about characters. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 different types of characters. The first one is a protagonist. That is a new word, I think, for some 8th graders. It means the main character, the hero, the one that the reader will root for, right? The antagonist is the opposite. It's the character who's in the conflict with the protagonist, the bad guy, right? If we are familiar with the story of Cinderella, Cinderella would be the protagonist, right? She's the good guy. She's the main character. She's the one the story's named after. She's the one you root for. The antagonist is the one who's getting in her way. The evil stepmother, her evil stepsisters, those are the bad guys. In addition to protagonist and antagonist, I'm going to start to talk about whether the character is static or dynamic. Now, those are important words when we talk about characters. A static character doesn't change throughout the story. They are static. You can think of static the same way you think of static on your phone. Like if you go through a tunnel or if you lose connection, it sounds like that noise. The noise never changes. It's boring. The same thing for a static character. The character doesn't change. They're the same throughout the entire story. A dynamic character is the opposite. That character will change in some way throughout the story. Usually learning life lessons or acting in a way that they didn't act in the beginning of the story. Rising action is what leads to the climax. This is the majority of your story. It's also where you're going to learn about the conflict, and we'll talk about conflict at a later time. There goes the hiker. The climax can be called a couple of things. The high point, the turning point, the most exciting part of the story. It's been called a lot of things. It's usually when the plot twists, something major happens, the main character changes in some significant way. You're going to be asked to identify the climax of the story. The falling action is what happens toward the end of the story. It's after the climax. It's when all the plot starts to get tied up, all the loose ends are tied up, and we start to kind of have all of our questions that we had throughout this story being answered. Which leads us to our resolution. This is when the story comes to a reasonable ending. We find out what happens to the main character. We find out, again, all of the loose ends should be tied up. Now, sometimes the author will leave a resolution kind of up in the air, so to speak, and you might feel that the story is cut off or it doesn't resolve itself. I know a lot of students, when they get to a story that has a kind of a weaker resolution, they feel really upset. They're like, well, what happened? I don't get it. The story just kind of cuts off. Sometimes the author will do that intentionally, and that's to leave the reader opportunity to make up their own ending. It's a little unsatisfying, I know, but most of the time the author will give you a solid resolution. So just to kind of review, this will be the end of this video. The story plot, or the plot of any story, whether it be a short story or a novel, will have all of these steps. Make sure you understand them to the best of your ability. Write down questions so that when I go over this in class, you have good questions and I can answer all of them.